We have a very large emphasis on the course tonight, specifically tailored toward how to deal with the most recent storm that has wreaked havoc throughout the state of Texas and delivered this new energy crisis. Tonight's course as well will outline really how to identify who is liable for damages that the practice may be suffering from. If you've at all had to shut down the practice to make way for repairmen, contractors, electricians, plumbers to come into your unit to fix busted pipes, replace that wet drywall, or broken HVAC systems, I do want to spend some time tonight reviewing the course or reviewing the office lease material to help determine really who is responsible for these damages. Is it the landlord? Is it the tenant? But before we do get started, please note that the information reviewed tonight is also, of course, applicable for anyone who's looking to lease new office space, anyone who's considering renewing their office lease, if you're within a 2-year timeline until your current lease expiry, anyone who is currently considering expanding their office or undergoing a restoration, or for those in the midst of selling their practice and hoping to enter into retirement. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Cirrus, we're a firm that was founded, let's see the screen here. For those unfamiliar with Cirrus, we're a dental specialized tenant representation firm. And we were founded in 1994 by a group of doctors in Alberta, Canada. And since our inception, we've negotiated well over 12,000 commercial office leases on behalf of our clients. We have an in-house legal, leasing, and consulting department that really all work in conjunction to best represent the needs of our clients. Annually, we'll represent just over 700 clients in negotiations with their landlords across Canada and the United States, and we deliver 100+ continuing education courses, typically in a live in-person seminar, but obviously with travel restrictions and the way that everything has been since COVID, a lot of these courses now are restricted to the online function. We do, and in the past, we would, of course, be guests at the major dental conventions, such as the Greater New York Dental Meeting, the PDC, the Yankee Dental Conference, the CDA. We do really work with clients across both Canada and the US, all the way from Hawaii to the Florida Keys. The purpose of the webinar today is really to take a deep look at the most recent property damage that has come out of this storm in Texas. Again, the geography focus for tonight's webinar is really specific to the state of Texas. And given all the drama that's come out of the most recent storm last week, we just really want to take some time to look at the lease document and see who's responsible for these repairs. Again, if you've had pipes burst because of this cold weather, is it the tenant that's going to have to pay for these repairs? Is it the landlord? We do have an introductory poll that is prompted. So if you have a minute just to submit some more answers, we're just looking to get to better know some of the attendees on tonight's course. It just provides us and our marketing team with a little bit more information in terms of why the course information is relevant to you and your practice, and perhaps how we can tailor future courses to help you or your colleagues. Secondly, tonight, I'm going to discuss just the importance of the office lease and how it really is specific to that of the value of a dental office. Again, it's applicable for anyone considering signing a new lease document, whether it be for your first office lease agreement or if you're opening up a second practice. If you're going through an office lease renewal and you have the lease document coming up for its expiry and you're hoping to stay within the current location and deal with that landlord, we'll take a look at how to really kind of position yourself in these tough times of COVID. Emphasize the fact that you as a dentist are able to still pull people to the building where a lot of your neighbors, those businesses that are having to work from home now, or if unfortunately they've gone out of business, and there's vacancy at the property, how you can leverage this fact to really negotiate more favorable terms with the landlord. If you are going through an expansion to build out that fifth or sixth offertory, or if you now have to undergo a very large and expensive restoration to help restore the premises, we're going to take a look at really how you can, again, emphasize and leverage the fact that you're a very valuable tenant to the landlord, and just address this within the lease agreement. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, we are just going to take some time to discuss the whole transferring aspect of the lease document. So if you are considering potential sale of the practice, the information will be relevant. I do have a few key examples that we'll get to later on throughout the webinar, and they will just outline basically a couple of copy and paste clauses that I've taken from some actual client documents, and you can all use if you perhaps have a copy of your office lease with you tonight, just to see if that language is perhaps similar to what you have in front of you. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about a treatment plan, really how to take some of the information tonight and use it and equip yourselves when you're dealing with the asset manager or the landlord who is trying to make things difficult for the practice, whether it be talking about the rental rates or the business terms of the lease, how to take your position that you're in now and really position it to provide yourself with some much needed relief, whether it be rent relief or a longer term extension, just to better understand the climate that we're in right now with COVID and the storm as of last week, and how to position things with your landlord. So primarily to discuss just the damages that a lot of people have been calling us to talk about. I think over the last week, we've received probably 100+ calls from practice owners throughout Texas, just merely asking, what do I do? And how do I have the landlord pay for some of the damages that the practice space has undergone? Again, whether it's the drywall that has to get replaced because the mold is going to set in a couple of years due to the fact that the unit is wet, or if the HVAC system is down and the landlord's trying to have you pay for the repairs. How do we determine really who is going to pay for what, and how do we move forward? A lot of the calls that we did receive were obviously rather unfortunate and dramatic, but it is just the kind of the result of the situation. For anyone in a tenancy situation, all of the answers really do lie in writing within the lease contract, right? If you're a property owner, a lot of the security that you have within your building is found in the foundation. But for those of you leasing your office space, that security is really dependent on the strength of the lease contract. It more or less is the foundation for the practice, as it will outline the strength of the relationship or that commitment that you have with the property owner, and what rights do you have as a tenant with them. In 90% of commercial office lease agreements, there's always going to be a repairs and maintenance section. And the definition of this clause is very much in the title, but it specifically outlines who is responsible for what. So if you're the landlord, obviously it's better for you to levy the expenses of those repairs, of the maintenance costs to the tenants. Who has to pay for what? If there's damage to the plumbing, the electrical, any of those very expensive HVAC repairs, it's better for a landlord to be sure that all of their tenants have to help pay for those expenses, so that from the landlord's perspective, they're not exposed to those very, very costly expenses that can come monthly or annually. But the best way to determine who's responsible is simply to look in your lease document and go to that specific clause, to go to that repairs and maintenance section. If you have a triple net lease, and for anyone renting space in a very large retail plaza or a medical office building, you're most likely on what's called the triple net lease. 99% of commercial office leases are all structured this way, so that the landlord can really push all of those additional rent costs to the tenants, so that they're not exposed to have to help pay for a lot of the additional rent costs that are hard to anticipate, much like the expenses that are coming out from the storm last week. So the triple net lease, again, the first N is for the basically just outlining the base rent rate that you would have agreed to when you first signed that lease document, or if you're looking to sign a new lease agreement on new office space. I'm sure the listing broker or the landlord has really advertised what the base rental rate is. But for all of you who have been practicing and have had a lease agreement in place, you'll be very well aware that that's never the total amount of rent that you end up paying at the end of each month. There's always additional costs on top of that base rental rate. And those triple net charges, those taxes, maintenance, insurance costs, the operating costs, the additional rents, they're really all just synonyms for every kind of additional expense that it takes to run the building. So if the landlord has snow removal, then they're going to levy that expense to you as a tenant. If there's any kind of additional capital expenditure on the building and the landlord doesn't want to be the one who has to pay for any of those investments into the property, they can actually proportionately distribute those charges to the tenants. And if there's a lot of vacancy in the building, unfortunately, the lion's share of that proportionate expense will fall on the few tenants that still remain in the building. Texas has been doing primarily well throughout COVID in terms of the submarket economies, but with the drama from last week, I know that a lot more expenses are now going to be found to be paid out by those tenants. So review the repairs and maintenance section of your lease, and please refer to the definition and the subsections of all of the operating costs or additional rent clauses within the document. A lot of landlords now realize, if they didn't before, but they now absolutely will realize how wildly expensive it is to build out a dental office. Anyone who's gone through the process of building out the space that they have now from scratch, all the way from identifying the location to going through the permitting and design and build out, I'm sure you won't forget that $150 per square foot minimum it costs to build out an operatory. And for the very capital intensive nature it is when owning and running a dental practice, a landlord, if they have the chance to push back on helping pay for the repairs that can cost as much as $150 per square foot, they're going to do that. And the fallout from last week is definitely going to result in a lot more repair and rebuilds for these practices that have suffered damages just from the bad weather or from the repairs that are necessary to get things up and running again. And that's not the limit of expenses, of damages that the practices will occur. Obviously, with the doors closed and patient appointments canceled, that's revenue lost. So we just need to remind ourselves that obviously with the capital intensive nature of owning a dental practice, that we're really not exposed to those additional operating costs that a typical office or retail tenant would be. If you're considering to take this opportunity to try and relocate the practice, please refer to the lease document to be sure that you're not held liable, so that if you're looking to move and the landlord wants to take this opportunity to have the unit restored back to its previous condition, if it were, a vacant vanilla shell office when you originally took over the space, if you're looking to leave now, in most lease contracts, the landlord can hold the tenant accountable for restoring the unit back to the original condition it was found in. I did have a couple of calls earlier this week with practice owners who are considering to try to take this opportunity with the damages and repair bills to try to move to new space because they weren't happy with either their landlord or their location, and they just want to use this as an opportunity to move. Before doing that, of course, just be sure that you're not going to be held responsible for making those repairs to the unit or completely rebuilding it back to the base building standards, back to those studs as to when you had originally taken it over. Just as I had mentioned as well, if your practice wasn't shut down during the height of COVID, months, it could be shut down now if there's a lot of repairs and time needed to just basically rebuild the space or renovate the unit. So for those of you who are looking to sell the practice, that's something tough to keep in mind, because when the books are being reviewed and an appraiser is trying to determine the value and the worth of the practice, but there's gaps for missed months or weeks of revenue, this unfortunately will affect the practice value. So we just need to be sure that if we're considering retiring, we want to really know what we're able to resell the practice for, keeping in mind the fact that the COVID effect to the books and this repair liability could unfortunately decrease the practice value. I am going to spend a bit of time talking about how we can help. We at Cirrus can provide some just in-depth analysis on the lease document to see who's liable. We do offer a lease review service that's been subsidized by the partners of ours who have sponsored this course at Henry Schein. So just as I think a precursor to that slide at the end of the course, we will have a lease review service that I'm very happy to offer those of you who might be curious in terms of who's actually liable to be held responsible for repairing the space. I had spent some time with our market research team basically to determine, what are the active listings like right now in some of the different submarkets within the state of Texas. And just a quick snapshot that we took on Monday, looking at Austin. These are all of the most recent transactions and new listings that are available for lease that would all accommodate a new incoming dental tenant. So space within a retail plaza, a medical office building, all available for lease or just having leased the premises over the past month. Here's just a quick snapshot at the most active and recent look at Austin. As I mentioned before, Texas as a whole had a pretty steady and healthy submarket economy in comparison to all of the US. But after last week, there was a very, very large uptick in listings. So a lot of landlords are suffering from vacancies, and they're really trying to get active and ahead of their lease agreements that might be coming up for expiry, and they're trying to attract new high value tenants. Here's another quick snapshot of San Antonio. Again, a very, very large increase in those available properties coming up for lease or having just leased, just proving the fact that a lot of landlords are really motivated to try to either renew lease documents with their current tenants. Again, all properties that would facilitate a dental practice or leases that were just renewed. And then finally, Houston. I didn't want to spend too much time looking at all the different cities, but just as a final snapshot, here is a quick glance at the market report for Houston, just again, with all of the very high increased activity that we're seeing within the submarket of Houston. So Texas as a whole obviously has been a very hot market, very good product, but with the damages from last week, we're seeing just a lot more listings come onto the market, and with those increased vacancies, there is going to be that correction by way of the advertised rental rates. To take it back a step and just to talk about basically what is a lease document, I think it's important for a practice owner to remind themselves that a lease document isn't really just a one-page agreement that's going to outline term and rent. I mean, of course, beyond the fact that it's for sure the second largest expense that a practice will ever have next to payroll, the lease agreement is something that's going to entail a whole great number of business terms that basically identify what you as a practice owner are responsible for. And again, when you're looking to sell the practice, this is something that is going to be transferred to the buyer and could very well affect the practice value in terms of what it could eventually sell for. So please look beyond the dollar value per month, and try to understand that for yourself as a dental practice owner, the lease document is something that could negatively affect the practice value when it comes time to sell the actual asset. And it is something as well that you need to realize is unfortunately not as big of a deal for the typical office or retail tenant. But given that hyper specificity of what it is that you do, a lot of the terms within the lease contract can really end up affecting a dental practice negatively, right? A restoration clause or repairs and maintenance section is not going to affect the typical restaurant or dry cleaning tenant. But given the fact that a dentist has a very large initial expense to build out the office space, the lease contract really should reflect that, and those terms need to be found beyond that initial rent commitment. So why is it so well? For a number of reasons. Of course, the office location is definitely the foundation for the practice, and within the lease premises, if you are in a tenancy situation, it really is going to be the foundation for the leased practice space. I've already mentioned the incredible investment it takes to build out the office space, and that unfortunately is money that is sometimes very difficult to recapture, right? If you're investing $500,000 to build out your office space, and the landlord has you responsible for restoring the premises, and you have to pull all of that electrical, all of that plumbing out of the unit, it's going to cost just about the same to replace that plumbing and electrical as it would have when you originally built out the unit. It's very, very difficult and expensive to move, not just for the initial expenses of, having to build out new space, but just the time it takes alone to go through the process of notifying your patients that there's going to be a new location, perhaps having the doors closed for a couple of days or a couple of weeks. It is a very, very costly endeavor. So typically the rule of thumb is if you don't have to relocate, please don't go through that very large headache. Fourthly, it's very important, of course, because it can help make or break the practice sale. If you have a lease agreement that really doesn't outline a number of issues, then a buyer for the practice is not at all going to be worried about taking over this large commitment with a landlord. And the flip side of that, of course, if you have a lease that perhaps has a lot of tenant responsibilities, it's not going to be as attractive as a purchase for the buyer, because they in turn have to take over those responsibilities from you. Just a quick 3 main sellable components for the practice, and this applies for somebody who's leasing their office space. Well, first and foremost, it's the appraised value of the equipment. That is definitely something that can be resold for a practice owner. Secondly, it's the goodwill or patient charts, all of those booked appointments that are basically going to outline what the practice can bill in the coming weeks, months, or year even. And then thirdly, the lease document. If you can't transfer the lease, if you have difficulty going throughout that process, it can significantly reduce the value of the practice by up to 50%. Oftentimes as well, because the value of the leasehold improvements is really tied to that of the actual the property itself, and you would have a difficult time basically recouping the value for those leasehold improvements. So what should the lease do for the typical dental practice owner? Well, it should provide fair and affordable financial terms. If you're looking to lease new office space, you want to be sure that you have months of free rent so that you can, invest the time it takes to build out the office space. And while you're building it out, you're not having to make that monthly rental payment. Secondly, it should provide a long-term and stable and secure home for the practice. If you're renewing your lease agreement and you know that you're going to be within the same property for the next decade or 2 decades, don't just renew the lease for another 2 years or another 5 years. Let's provide a 10-year proposal with options to renew beyond that so that you have predictability for the practice space and so that you can provide the landlord with something that they really want, more term commitment, more rental income for the property. And in exchange for that offer, you can see other concessions made in the lease agreement, like a rent reduction or a release of liability. Thirdly, it of course should minimize risk and exposure. So to the comment I just made about releasing that liability, if you're looking to sign a new lease agreement, please sign the lease under a professional corporation. Don't sign the lease document personally, and don't provide a guarantor on top of a company if you were able to list the tenancy under the company name. We just want to be sure that you're not signing anything personally so that if anyone's trying to seek damages from that of the assets listed under that of who had signed the lease agreement, that the exposure is limited to that of the practice corporation listed as the tenant, not the individual who would have and often is asked to sign. So it definitely should limit that exposure to you and your estate. The lease document as well should provide some very good flexibility. A lot of people now are looking for a right of first refusal, an ability to perhaps purchase the building where you're practicing should it become available for sale. But definitely the lease contract should provide you with some degree of flexibility to, again, either purchase the property or expand that office space if you have those plans of outgrowing your 1,000 to 3,000 square feet. And it should absolutely enhance your ability to eventually sell the practice. Again, there's a very large emphasis on the transferability of a lease contract for a dentist, because if you can't transfer the lease to somebody in the future, then your practice that could be worth, well more than what it produces in a year, then it's going to be significantly impacted, because if the buyer can't take over the lease document, then all that they can really purchase is the goodwill and the patient charts. They're not going to benefit from the location of the practice if the lease agreement cannot be transferred to them. So what's in your lease document? So I do have a couple of examples here that basically show some copy and paste clauses that I found from some lease contracts, and all the names were changed for confidentiality purposes, but it's just important to be familiar with what some of these terms mean. It's not all just legal jargon. It's something that a lot of us have agreed to without perhaps really reading through the lease document. So let's take a deeper look and really find out what's in our lease. The force majeure clause, which is typically something that a bank would encourage a landlord to include within their lease, is just outlining the fact that even if there's an act of God, a tenant is still responsible for paying rent. Even if there's a natural disaster, a tenant's still responsible for paying rent. That's what that clause means. A lot of those calls that I took earlier this week and over the weekend from practice owners in Texas saying, is there any kind of ability for me to not pay rent because of the storm, because of the power shutdown? Unfortunately, because of a clause like the force majeure clause, it does provide the landlord with the legal protection to say, well, hang on now, you signed this lease contract, and it says, despite any kind of act of God or natural disaster, that you as the tenant still have to pay me rent. In this example here, you can see just in the highlighted sentence that except for tenant's obligation to make timely payment of rent and other amounts due, which shall remain in full force and effect, despite anything, would still occur. So just if you have the force majeure, please review it yourself, take a quick peek, or connect with us or one of my colleagues after just throughout the polling session at the end of the webinar, and we'll be happy to provide some insight in terms of what your force majeure clause might actually look like. Secondly, the repairs and maintenance section 20 minutes ago. Again, we'll outline basically who is responsible for what. Is the landlord responsible for repairing the plumbing if the pipe had burst? This was a copy and paste paragraph from one of the repairs and maintenance clauses within a lease document that we had on file. And you can see here that it outlines that tenant shall, at its own expense, own cost and expense, repair and maintain the premises. And particularly relating to the HVAC unit, that's a very expensive piece of hardware to either repair or let alone replace. So the repairs and maintenance section is something that, of course, a lot of people are paying a lot of attention to now because they're going through this back and forth argument with the property owner to try to simply determine who has to pay for what. I was speaking with just a practice owner in a small retail building, and the HVAC system was on the roof directly above where they practice at that end cap unit that they had. And it was completely damaged and basically determined on initial assessment that it had to be replaced. The replacement was an obscene amount of money, but just unfortunately due to language that was in their lease, it's their responsibility to have to make that replacement. And there's simply nothing that they can do to make the landlord accountable. So please, if you're having difficulty with the HVAC repair or with an air conditioning unit, you just need to basically refer to the repairs and maintenance section because oftentimes that's where it's going to identify who has to pay for what. The option to renew. So you who have a lease agreement coming up for expiry, or for those of you who are looking to lease new office space, an initial 5 or 10-year term might seem like a very long commitment, but from a lot of the practice owners that we speak with, those years go by very, very quickly. And now all of a sudden being in the position of having to pick up the phone and being in that same position with the landlord to ask for more rent term, for more lease term is an annoying and redundant position to be in, because it should have ideally been outlined from the onset of leasing the space. For those of you who are looking to transfer the lease and sell the practice, if you have a transferable option to renew that can apply to somebody who's looking to take over the practice space, that's really going to benefit them when it comes time to financing. Because if they have to take the lease document to the bank and basically prove that they'll have the premises for X amount of years, that can very well help satisfy their financing condition. However, if they're trying to get a loan on only 1 or 2 years of transferable term, it's going to be very difficult for that applicant to be able to pay back the lender in that scenario. So you can see here, just as an example, the option to renew is flawed because this particular provision really only applied to Dr. Joe Black. Dr. Joe Black, of course, is just an alias, a fake name that I'd replace the real doctor name with. But you can see here, and if it's similar to your option to renew, that it can be problematic because it basically outlines that Dr. Joe Black shall remain as the tenant, and if the tenant duly and is regularly paid its rent and has performed its covenants and obligations under this lease and has not been in default, then they would have the option to renew the lease with a notice deadline of 9 months prior to the expiry. But this example outlines how it's only applicable. So you want to make sure with your option to renew, if you have one, that it's applicable to somebody who would take over the space. We also want to make sure, ideally, that the option to renew rent term is going to be tied to the current market rental rate. For anyone who's looking to renegotiate their rental rates right now in a lease renewal, it's a very good time to be doing that, because with a down economy and everything flipping on its head from being a landlord market to now a tenant market, you're in a good position to make a strong argument for what the rent commitment should be for the next 5 to 10 years and options to renew beyond that. The assignment clause, just on the topic of transferring the lease and selling the practice, is a very important one, obviously, because we need the ability to transfer the foundation for the lease premises to somebody who's going to take over the practice. So looking at this example, perhaps just try to give it a quick read through to see if you can identify where it's problematic. Again, this is something that's going to be found in a great deal of commercial office leases because it outlines the tenant ability to assign the lease from themselves to somebody else. So I hope you were able to identify more than one potentially problematic sentence because there's a great deal. But you can see firstly that this assignment is predicated on the tenant receiving the landlord's consent to go through the transfer. If the tenant is unable to go through the consent portion of the assignment, if they're unable to receive the landlord's willingness to allow them to transfer the lease document to somebody who would come in and take over the practice, what would happen to that practice owner's practice sale? If you couldn't put this lease agreement that you've signed into somebody else's name who's trying to buy the practice, simply what is going to happen when you're looking to sell the practice? Unfortunately, for a dentist, it can kill the actual sale of the business. So instead of arbitrary consent or assignment provision that would allow the landlord to withhold their ability for you to transfer the lease document, we would rather prefer to see a more tenant-friendly clause that would outline your option to transfer the lease and not allow the landlord to withhold their consent. You can see in this specific example, like many other lease documents that have an assignment clause, that the landlord would have several options just at the mere request of the tenant's request to transfer the lease. And that includes the option to actually terminate the lease document. And again, if you're looking to sell your practice and now you have no term to put in the buyer's name, it's going to drastically negatively affect the value of that actual practice. Looking towards the bottom of the paragraph as well, you can see that the tenant would not be released from the liability or the contract itself. Of course, when we're looking to transfer the agreement and actually sell the practice, the seller needs to be sure that they're not held continuously liable so that they're not on the hook if they're able to go through the process of assigning the lease document to the buyer, that if that new buyer, that new practice owner is unable to make rent payments, unable to run a business, we don't want to be responsible for somebody else's negligence. We want to be sure that no, when you're set to retire and transfer the lease, that you're free and clear of that responsibility, because that's really what you've worked for. That's what you're working towards, is that eventual practice sale. A number of other provisions within the lease document that can be problematic. There's obviously a very long list here, but I've highlighted a couple. People in those high value markets, the suburbs with growing populations and a lot of construction, those real estate developers or real estate investment trust with a very wordy lease document will often have a relocation clause, allowing them the ability to remove or relocate a tenant to another unit within the plaza, or a demolition right to essentially terminate the lease document and demolish the building in the hopes of putting up a condo building or changing the building itself. This can often be a very difficult reality for a practice owner, because if you're having your practice appraised and someone identifies that that relocation liability or that demolition clause exists within your lease, it's going to give the buyer a very strong argument to essentially reduce their offer price. We don't ever want to have the landlord ability to review the financial statements for the business. So being sure that the landlord is not basically given the right to review your books, your revenue, is important. And then just in the interest of time, I'll just outline the subordination clause. So just toward the bottom there, The subordination clause is relevant to bring up now because basically it outlines the fact that if the landlord defaults on their mortgage payments, that in fact the lease document is subordinate to that of the bank. So if the bank ever foreclosed on the property, then your rights as a tenant would be inferior or subordinate to that of the new foreclosing landlord. So we just want to be sure that that's not something that would ever affect you. And in replacement of that, you should have a non-disturbance agreement. So regardless of who owns the property, your business, your lease terms are not disturbed. And it's relevant to bring up now, just with mortgage delinquencies being at an all-time high, and with the commercial real estate market the way it is. Obviously, that was a big fallout after 2008. We saw a lot of foreclosures that happened a year to 2 years after that. So just being sure that you have that continued protection and you have that continued security, that you're not going to be worried about who actually owns the building. Is the building up for sale now? We're closing on the property. We'd like to really be sure that you're not exposed to the fact that the landlord might be in any kind of mortgage debt. There's a couple of key points to outline just in terms of tenant leverage. And as I mentioned earlier, if you're looking to lease new space, if you're looking to renew your office lease, or if you're looking to expand and restore the premises, or eventually transfer the lease and sell the practice, please do remind yourself that you have a great deal of power, a really strong footing to make a key argument with the property owner, and affect positive change. So that if you do have a very difficult lease contract, if it is very landlord onerous, that you as a tenant, you have the ability to actually affect change. Again, a landlord is going to be very, very excited and motivated to lease space right now to a dentist because they provide that very stable rent commitment. They would sign a long-term deal. And despite all of the increase in e-commerce and people working from home, a dentist is actually someone who's still able to draw foot traffic to the building. And that really helps with the overall asset value and the increase in value for the property itself. So for a new start, just to remind yourself not to sign anything that's going to be overly landlord friendly, but no, to have very mutually beneficial terms and not expose yourself as a new practice owner. Of course, for the renewal, definitely a great time to influence change with the landlord because they would be ever motivated to keep you. Just with the uncertainty in the market, there's definitely the kind of the landlord perspective of trying to keep someone who is a solvent and very stable business. If you are looking to expand and invest more money into the unit, the landlord, of course, would be influenced by that because you're essentially putting money into their property. You're investing money into something that they own, and they're in turn benefiting from that because of those invested dollars, those dollars that increase the value of the property that they own. So before doing that, as there definitely would need to be changes to the lease document, it's the best time to pick up the phone, have a conversation, basically outline to the landlord that changes need to be made to the lease because changes to the actual unit itself are going to be made as well. And then finally, again, prior to the actual practice sale, before trying to get the practice appraised, it's a very important time toward the end or latter half of the career to look at the lease document and make changes before someone else is going to look at it, before they have the chance to poke holes in the agreement and make an argument for a reduced offer price. As I mentioned, if there's that demolition clause, if there's that relocation liability, and a buyer now has the idea in mind to submit a reduced offer price, it can very well be as much as a $20,000-$30,000 reduction in that offer price for the practice, just because they don't want to be exposed to the liability. And that's if it's for a relocation, a demolition, a very heavy, additional rent section, but definitely prior to actually having the practice appraised and put on the market, to look at the lease agreement and make changes before that comes up. The tenant lease in particular to someone who's going through a renewal. So for those of you with a lease agreement coming up within 2.5 to 2 years, you're really within this sweet spot of being able to affect change. And it's important to note that you can make change, really good change within that amount of time, because a landlord could realize, and they would realize, that it would take about 2 years for a dental practice to identify new space, go through the zoning and permitting and design aspects of building out that new location and notifying patients of the move. That's just going to motivate a landlord to keep you in the current premises. So before actually committing to staying in the building, at least 2 years prior to that expiry is when it's most applicable to pick up the phone and start the negotiation process. When you get closer and closer toward the actual lease expiry, whether it's months or weeks, or if there's anyone who's on tonight's course that's an overhold tenant and you're month to month right now, there's really a dwindling and smaller argument to be made with the landlord as to why they should provide you with more favorable terms. And that's because they know that your business would, suffer a great deal if you had to relocate, because you can't find a new place within a very short amount of time. So definitely keep the tenant lease cycle in mind and note that it's best to get the process started up to 24 months before the actual lease expiry. As I mentioned before, we do provide a lease review service. So for anyone who's interested in having their actual lease document reviewed by myself or a colleague, we would spend 3 to 4 hours analyzing your lease, looking out for any inherent risks or liabilities to determine if this is going to affect the practice, and then simply just schedule a call with yourself. If there's any partners for the practice, they would be encouraged to join as well, or an office manager perhaps who had been the one dealing with the landlord or their leasing representation, basically to outline a treatment plan. But that $2,000 lease review service was thankfully taken care of by Henry Schein. They did a great deal at sponsoring this course and offering a service through us to their customers that have joined tonight's course because of the fallout from the storm last week. So anyone who's interested in a lease review, please don't hesitate to email myself. More than happy to coordinate with you and set up that appointment. And if I'm not able to reach out, then a colleague of mine will. But thank you so much for attending tonight's webinar. We've got a couple of minutes coming up here, so I'm just going to leave a few minutes now for the final poll. And it's, again, just in the interest of trying to better get to know the practice, see if there's any way that we can help. The lease review is something that, again, I would definitely recommend for anyone who is going through a challenging time right now with the energy crisis in Texas, and can very happily help coordinate that lease review. So I believe there's 3 to 4 questions just on the exit poll. And if there's any other questions, don't hesitate to enter them in the question and answer. I did receive one question from one of the attendees, and I'll just share it with the group without disclosing any names. Someone mentioned that they had passed their option to renew deadline. And what does this mean? So for clarity, again, the option to renew deadline basically is a window in time in terms of when you're supposed to notify the landlord that you want to stay within the premises and extend the life of the lease. So that would have meant that there was an option to renew to begin with, but they had simply missed their window to actually renew the lease. Unfortunately, that option to renew now has expired, and that significantly drops the leverage that the tenant would have in actually renewing the lease. It gives the landlord a lot more of an argument to, put increased rental rates there, because it makes that window of time kind of decrease quite a bit. So it definitely does not help from a leverage standpoint, but it does not mean that you're in a completely terrible situation. It gives the landlord a bit more control. It doesn't mean that you have to move or anything, but the conversation needs to start with the landlord in terms of how much term can be outlined for the upcoming expiry. Because if you've missed that window to actually renew the lease, then the expiry is on its way. And it's often within 6 months before that initial expiry. So if you have missed your option to renew, then please just, you need to start that lease renew conversation with the landlord as soon as possible. Someone asked again, what is the total value that the lease can relate for the practice value? Typically, it's up to 50%. Again, if the practice value is determined on those three main factors of the equipment, the goodwill, and the lease document, if you're in the position of only being able to sell the equipment and the goodwill because you can't transfer the lease, yes, the lease document can very well affect up to 50%, if not more, of the overall practice value. And that's because oftentimes practice's value is directly tied to its location. But if you can't transfer the lease and the landlord has plans of repurposing your unit to somebody else, a different business entirely, then it's absolutely going to negatively affect the overall value of the practice. Just looking through a couple more questions, and I'll answer one more just in the interest of time. We have 5 more minutes, and I'm sure everyone's eager to get back to their evenings. A demolition clause. So again, a demolition clause, it was just a demolition clause question mark, but a demolition clause, again, outlines typically a landlord's option to terminate the lease in the interest of repurposing the property for future development. So if your landlord is a very large institutional group and they have investment plans for the property to repurpose it and put up, my example before was a condo building, then unfortunately you could be looking at a notice to move. Just again, reviewing the lease is the best thing to see if you are exposed to that potential inherent risk. And it does drastically affect the overall value of the practice, because someone, again, who's looking at purchasing that asset, taking over that business, would not want to be exposed to potentially having to be served with a notice to move if their landlord wanted to demolish the building. Again, please, the exit poll, I hope everyone had a chance to answer that. Just if they're interested in a lease review, if there's any final questions, myself or a colleague will definitely follow up to answer any of those outstanding questions. But just in the interest of time, I hope you're all able to find the course of benefit. And for anyone that's suffering from the most recent storm and the outfall from the storm, it's a challenging time, but to really determine who is liable, who is responsible for what kind of repair, the answers do lie within the lease document, as it will outline who pays for what. Is it the landlord that has to pay for that replacement of the drywall and the pipe work, or is it the tenant? So just to review the lease, be very well aware of what you've signed on to, is the best thing to do in this situation. But thank you all for attending the course tonight, and enjoy the rest of your week.